Thanks everyone for attending. I am thrilled, and I hope everyone else is equally thrilled to hear from Dr. Delegard. She's the project director of the Mapping Prejudice Project. A third generation Minneapolitan, she trained originally as a women's historian and explored the history of women in politics in her early research. More recently, she has devoted her energy to public history and unearthing the complex past of her hometown. This focus has led to Mapping Prejudice and the Historiopolis Project, which she also founded. So super thrilled to hear, and I don't want to take any more time from her, so I'll just pass the baton over.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for having me and my colleagues. I have two colleagues with me here today, Penny Peterson, who's one of the co-founders of Mapping Prejudice, and Rebecca Gillette, who's our community engagement lead. And so while I'm talking, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And we'll either get to them at the end after I do my go through my slides. But Penny and Rebecca will also they can be sort of answering questions, as I'm talking to in the chat. So I'm so thrilled to be here and to talk about the work that we've been doing with Mapping Prejudice to illuminate how race has shaped neighborhoods and access to housing in Minneapolis over the last century. So, and I'm especially pleased to be with you in Linden Hills because I don't know, I think many of you might know this, but I grew up in Linden Hills, and this neighborhood in particular, as we've delved into the history, it really illuminates a lot of the complexities of this history. And so obviously this part of the city is really important to me personally. And it's my hope that the information and research that I'm going to share with you tonight and the conversation that I hope we can have tonight will be a starting point for future work to both acknowledge this history and also to start doing the reparative work, which is what you're talking about with a lot of the decisions that you're talking about in this committee, over time. So who am I? As Bali said, I am a third generation Minneapolitan. I actually went to the old Audubon Elementary School, what is now Lake Harriet Elementary School. And I was part of the last class of the Southwest Junior High School. I graduated from Southwest High School when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And then I left for Minneapolis to attend college on the East Coast and told my friends and my parents that I was never going to come back. So after college, I trained as a professional historian. I got a PhD in American history at Duke, and I did come home. So I came home with a husband and two little kids in tow. And those two little kids are now themselves graduates of the Minneapolis Public Schools and are actually now following my path and are attending college on the East Coast and have told me they're never coming back. So so we'll see. I hope they do follow my path and come back. So this homecoming that I had with my family, it really prepared me or it prompted me, I guess, to change gears professionally. So I trained as an academic historian. I was really primed to take a really conventional path and in terms of university work. But when I came home, I really wanted to explore the history of my hometown, and I wanted to do it in not a traditional academic way. So I would say that my return home really brought me face to face with what I now think of as a civic myth, that I grew up in the 1970s in Minneapolis. And I was really raised with an incredible amount of civic pride. I was actually, I think a lot of people thought of Minneapolis as something of an exceptional city, right? That a lot of people told me that Minneapolis, through really smart, progressive policymaking, had avoided a lot of the other problems that plagued other American cities. And I think this is true. But I think this belief really obscured a lot of other important facts, or one in particular, which is that Minneapolis has some of the highest racial disparities in the country. It has our city offers a really high quality of life for white people, but it can be a really hard place to be a Black person. So when I came back, I joined the chorus of people asking why, and I wanted to put my historical skills to use to understand how we got to this place. And it was these questions and this desire that prompted me to join with Penny and a couple of other colleagues to create Mapping Prejudice in 2016. And we did that actually in the corner of the Borchard Map Library at the University of Minnesota. What we wanted to do is we wanted to document the history of racism and housing in Minneapolis. And we focused on housing in particular because it provides the foundation for all these other indicators of well-being that people talk about when they talk about racial disparities in Minneapolis. That the quality of your housing determines so much about your life, so much about your prospects. It determines whether you will be healthy or sick, what kind of access to education you're going to have, whether your family is going to be able to amass wealth, and whether you're going to be able to pass that wealth to the next generation. So here in the Twin Cities, I think many of you are probably familiar with these statistics, but the statistics around housing and race are really striking. Whoops. The Twin Cities have the highest gap in the country between Black and white homeownership rates. That's for any metropolitan area in the country. So what does this mean? It means that 75% of white families own their own homes. Only 23% of Black families can make that same claim. And this, again, this is in a place where general prosperity levels are very high. We have a lot of resources here. So these current disparities that I'm highlighting here, one of the contentions of our project is that they're rooted in a critical turning point at the beginning of the 20th century, and that was this decision to use private contracts to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. So these private contracts were called racial covenants, which were clauses that were inserted into property deeds and sometimes written on plat maps to keep people who are not white from buying or occupying certain parcels of land. So they were composed and promoted by a huge cast of characters, realtors, city planners, bankers, elected officials, neighborhood associations, individual property owners, and they were used for most of the 20th century and also before that in the 19th century. They weren't the only thing. They worked in concert with other practices, white violence. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, real estate steering, redlining, and all these things worked together to keep people who are not white from owning land and homes. So the earliest covenant that we have found in Minnesota so far was put into place in South Minneapolis, not in Linden Hills, but in more in the near the Longfellow neighborhood. And I've put the text of this covenant up here on the screen. So this covenant dates from 1910, and this deed that's on the screen documents the transaction. Henry and Leonora Scott sold a property on 35th Avenue South to Nels Anderson. He was a Swedish baker, and this house wasn't fancy. It was really modest, and in fact, it had a chicken coop out back, but it had this racial restriction that said the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. So I want to offer a little bit of translation on those terms. Mongolian was an early 20th century term that was used to describe one of the so-called races of man. That's a sort of a scientific racism term. And it was meant to refer to people from Asia, but also Native Americans. And I want to say too that these ideas about the races of men and the differences between people were largely developed by academics at my own institution at the University of Minnesota. So those ideas about race came out of universities, but they were adopted by people in other areas, specifically realtors and real estate developers. And this particular covenant was written by a property developer, one of the largest property developers at the time in 1910, a man named Edmund Walton, and Edmund Boulevard that runs along the Mississippi River is named for him. So we don't know where he got inspiration for the language that he used, but we can say that the words make the intent of the covenant really clear. They were written to keep anyone who is seen as not white from owning any land. So Walton didn't stop with this first covenant. He inserted the same language into thousands of other deeds in Hennepin and Ramsey County. And across Minnesota, not just here in the Twin Cities, across Minnesota, hundreds of landowners, developers, and city officials followed Walton's lead. They composed dozens of variations on the text that he, on this language that he first put to text. So I'm going to read you a couple of examples. We do this in every presentation. It's disturbing language, though. I just want to make it clear. So no person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or a tenant. So these are really hard words to hear. They're brutal words, I think, in a lot of ways, but we think it's really important. We read these at every presentation. We think it's really important because it's part of the process of acknowledging this history, and we have to do that if we want to move forward together. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made covenants illegal everywhere in the country. And I would say once this happened, there was a real rush to forget, especially among white people. So what our project is doing is that we're trying to peel back this willful, what I've come to see as this willful amnesia, and empower communities to engage in this collective remembering. That's what we're doing here tonight. And we're also trying to create data that can help communities of color, especially demand change. But one thing that's really important to acknowledge when we're talking about these covenants is that there was nothing secret about them when they were in use. So racial covenants were printed in newspaper ads for new housing developments. They featured in plot lines of books and plays and movies. They were the subject of countless studies and news reports. And covenants were, stories about covenants were passed down through families. They were passed through Black, Asian, Jewish, and Native American families. But even with this rich record, we had so much information about covenants. When we started this work, there was a lot of really basic questions that we couldn't answer. Like, what did covenants say? What was the language of the covenants? Where were they used? How common were they? How much land did they cover? And so these were the questions that we came together, our team, our Mapping Prejudice team came together to try to answer. And we decided to do this in a somewhat, in a definitely unconventional way. We took digitized property records from Hennepin County, and we used computers to flag the documents that seemed to have racist language. And then we went out to community groups like this one. We harnessed the power of community, we always say. We put these property records that had been flagged into a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. And this allowed us to invite thousands of volunteers into this work. For our Hennepin County map, we had 3,000 volunteers who found over 24,000 property parcels that have racial covenants. And then we expanded our work to include St. Paul, and we had another more than 3,000 volunteers join us for this effort. So when we put all of this information on a map, this is what we got. So what you're seeing on your screen is you're seeing the spread of racial covenants through Hennepin and Ramsey County over time. So you can see the years ticking by in the upper right-hand corner. And each one of these blue dots denotes an individual property parcel that was reserved exclusively for the use of white people. So when we get to the end of the time lapse here, you'll see all the land that we have identified as having racial covenants. And I want to be clear, we're still working on Ramsey County. We do believe that we're going to find quite a few more racial covenants in Ramsey County. And we have, we're still working on the whole metro area. Our goal is to do all 7 counties. We have property records from Dakota County, Anoka County, and Washington counties, and we're working on getting them ready for volunteers to help us identify racial covenants in those areas too. And then I think we're going to get a much fuller picture of the extent of these racial restrictions in the Twin Cities. But as I'm talking about this, I want to be clear, this is not just a Minnesota phenomenon. These racial restrictions were used in every region and every community. They were promoted through national institutions, namely the federal government, professional organizations like the National Association of Realtors, various, definitely all kinds of federal bureaucracies that governed the real estate industry. But we can say actually, like, really any public or private institution that was involved in any way with the buying and selling of land or real estate ended up promoting covenants. And so that's why we're working with researchers across the country to map these. We're not just limited to Minnesota. And our goal is we would like to create a national data set that we can use to understand the damage that was done and hopefully drive meaningful change. So right now we're actually working with a team in Milwaukee to map covenants there, and we need volunteers. You can get to this, the portal to volunteer to help us read these deeds from Milwaukee through our website. You can click on this QR code. And we offer weekly volunteer sessions where you are most welcome. We would love to have you. And I want to say that these volunteer sessions, which are run by my colleagues Penny Peterson and Rebecca Gillette, who are also on this call, that they are safe spaces to contribute to this research, to understand this history, and to process, what it means. So, and it's great for groups like this one. It's great to do it with neighbors or people you are already in relationship with, maybe through a faith organization. So just a plug to our ongoing volunteer efforts. And I want to say too that at some point we'd like to really map. We'd like to have a sense of how many covenants there are across Minnesota. We know they're in every county, in part because people send them to us. People who work in the industry, like land surveyors, send them to us. We know they're everywhere, but nobody has ever done a systematic search for these in rural areas. And we think understanding the extent of these restrictions would really be illuminating. So the text that I read you shows how, it's meant to show you how these contracts were explicitly racist. The map is meant to show these are not individual, they're really widespread, right? It's also important to understand how powerful they were. So covenants ran with the land, which meant that once they were there, once they were put into place, they were there forever. It didn't matter how many times a piece of property changed hands or what was built there, the racial restriction stayed. It stayed connected to the land. And anyone who breached a covenant, they ended up in court and losing any kind of equity that they had developed in that piece of land. So a breach of a covenant triggered a process that put the land back in the hands of the person who put the covenant in the first place. And if that person were no longer alive, it would go to their heirs. So people ask us about this. They ask us these seem so heinous, right? What was the resistance to covenants? And I want to make one thing clear is that these were really popular at the time that they were being used. We have opinion surveys done, especially in the 1940s in Minnesota, that show that white people believed that these restrictions were really beneficial. So white people believed that racial restrictions protected property values and protected neighborhood harmony. So Black people, by contrast, saw covenants very differently. They saw covenants as a threat to basic liberty. So in Minnesota, we have leaders like Nellie Francis and Madison Jackson and Lena Olive Smith and James Wardlaw and Katie McWatt, who devoted their lives to fighting these practices. They challenged the premise and the practice of restricting housing for white people. They bought houses for covenants. With covenants, they moved into white neighborhoods. And some of you might have heard the story of the Lee family who faced an angry mob in the summer of 1931 after buying a house in South Minneapolis. And the Lees were the kinds of activists who made these kinds of challenges. And they did so with the help of the NAACP, which actually led the legal campaign against covenants across the United States. And this legal campaign led to the Supreme Court, which handed down the Shelley v. Kramer decision in 1948 that made covenants unenforceable. So that wasn't enough to stop people from putting covenants in. That's why it took the Fair Housing Act of 1968 to actually make covenants illegal. So historians like me, we know the limits of laws, but we also like tidy chronologies and triumphant narratives. And I would say that's why for many years, historians ended the story of covenants with this landmark legislation. So this was the story that people told, like covenants were terrible, but American values prevailed. Our institutions bent the arc of history towards justice, end of story. So, but I'm here today. Mapping Prejudice exists as a project because there's more to the story. So covenants have been illegal for 50 years. Why do we care? Why do we need to know about these? And I would say that we need to understand this history because we're still living with the legacies of it, of the practices. But to really understand what are the legacies, we have to understand how these restrictions change the urban landscape. So I'm going to try to show some of that by focusing on the history of Linden Hills. This neighborhood illustrates how the landscape changed in the city, in part because of racial covenants. So people in Linden Hills, people in this neighborhood have always been interested in the history of the place they live in. So we started sharing our work, our Mapping Prejudice work here in 2018. That was the year that we decided, and my team will never forgive me for this, to participate in the Art Shanties project on Lake Harriet, where we worked with an artist named Sarah San Pedro and put together an art installation that tried to illustrate this history of racial covenants. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the Art Shanties, it's an art happening on Lake Harriet where artists take what would be like an ice fishing structure and make them into artistic installations, creative installations. So working with Sarah San Pedro, you can see this is our art shanty. We papered the inside of the shanty with these property deeds, and we asked people to find the covenants on the walls of the shanty. And we also printed our map, which was still in progress, and we asked people to look at the map of covenants and use pins to locate their homes on the map. So when people first looked at this map, the people who came into the shanty, and they examined the area around Linden Hills, around Lake Harriet, a lot of them were really happy. They were overjoyed to see that Linden Hills didn't have a high concentration of covenants. And many people took this as a sign that the neighborhood had always been a welcoming enclave. So we tried to explain, this was our first foray, really, and we tried to explain that the story was more complicated. To be fair, we were doing this while we were standing on a frozen lake in an unheated structure in what turned out to be one of the coldest weekends in more than a decade. And it's definitely hard to both convey and to absorb a nuanced historical narrative when it's 20 below zero. So, but this experience made us realize that we had to figure out how to explain that covenants shape neighborhoods in different ways, even when they weren't physically present in a space. So what covenants did is they really hardened racial boundaries in American cities. And this created more than legal barriers. Covenants really normalized new ideas about race and place. And these racial restrictions created new norms for behavior. And specifically, they encouraged white violence. So our research shows that covenants worked in tandem with this violence to reshape the racial demographics of Minneapolis. So Linden Hills doesn't have many covenants. And the reason for this is that the neighborhood was platted before racial covenants came into use in 1910. And at that moment in time, the neighborhood was pretty integrated. Black residents lived here and they owned property. And you can see this. This is a core pleth demographic map from 1910. It shows, so again, it shows like the city is not particularly segregated. You can see how there are darker polygons that are spread all over the city. That means that indicates the presence of Black residents. So in this corner of the city, there were, right in this neighborhood, there were 13 Black residents. So by 1940, all of these people had left the neighborhood. They were all pushed out, not just out of Linden Hills, they were pushed out of most of the neighborhoods across the city. By 1940, Black residents in Minneapolis had been concentrated into a couple of small neighborhoods. So how did this happen? The ideas that drove the adoption of covenants also prompted neighbors in Linden Hills to mount a coordinated campaign to force Black families out of the neighborhood. So we have started mapping the flashpoints of this effort. And here are some of the stories that we have uncovered in Linden Hills. So in 1909, neighbors organized when word got out that a Black minister named William Malone had made arrangements to buy a house at 4441 Zenith Avenue. So over 100 neighbors gathered for what they called an indignation meeting. Some threatened to burn the house rather than see Malone take possession. And they told the newspaper that they were determined to, quote, prevent the establishment of what they called a dark town in their midst. They hired a lawyer to fight the transaction. And eventually they pooled their funds to buy the home and keep it out of the hands of Malone. So after they were successful with Malone, they turned their attention to another family. A woman named Mary Myrick had lived in the neighborhood since 1903. She bought a lot that was 6 blocks from the home of her daughter and son-in-law, Moses and Mary Burke. She paid cash and built a modest home. And she shared that home with her sister, her niece, and several grandchildren. She supported her family by doing domestic work for other families nearby. In 1910, right after the neighbors had targeted Malone, Myrick was targeted by what the newspaper called a race war. So neighbors declared that they would make what they called a strong attempt to oust the quote unquote the Negro families living in the vicinity of their homes. So Myrick refused to leave, and she told neighbors, much to their outrage, that she would accept no less than $4,500 for the house that was home for her extended family. So the newspaper reported that, quote, as an effort to force her to move, the neighbors and those in the vicinity will refuse to give her any more work, believing she will have to leave the neighborhood. Despite this threat, despite these harassments, Myrick hung on to her house until 1918, when she did finally sell the property. And we found other stories of what were known as, quote, indignation meetings in Linden Hills in the years between 1910 and 1940, including an indignation meeting that was actually held at the Linden Hills Library in 1932. And this kind of harassment was meant to make people feel unwelcome and unsafe. And it worked with covenants to transform a relatively mixed city into a racially segregated city in these years. So as we expand our map of Hennepin and Ramsey County, what we've learned to do is we've learned to look at the space between the covenants. So the covenants are in green on this map, and some of the incidents of racial violence are in those little red dots on the map. So you can see that they're in the blank spaces, between the covenants. So other neighborhoods are blanketed with covenants. We haven't found the same accounts of racial terror there, because in those neighborhoods, there was actually no one to terrorize. So, and after 1910, as new neighborhoods came online, they were gated with covenants. They were covered with covenants. So after Linden Hills developed. Today, those are still, those neighborhoods that had covenants are still the whitest neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And the neighborhoods where Black people were allowed to settle after 1910 were redlined. And that was the practice that tried to rate neighborhoods as safe or unsafe investment risks according to the racial composition of the people who live there. So it's all these things together. It's covenants, it's racial violence, it's these discriminatory lending practices that have made it really hard for people who are not white to buy homes or even find stable, safe, affordable, and decent housing. So I've already talked about the fact that I grew up in Linden Hills, and that's just one of the ways that this this history is personal to me. So again, like I'm a third generation Minneapolitan. At the same time that residents of South Minneapolis were harassing people like Mary Myrick, people like the Lees, they were welcoming my grandparents. So my grandparents were immigrant. They were from immigrant families. They were three of them were immigrants themselves, with roots in Sweden. And they did not start life with a lot of what you would call conventional advantages. So two of my grandparents were orphaned at really young ages. None of my grandparents made it past middle school. Two of my grandparents dropped out of school after 5th grade. And they worked as domestic servants. They worked as farm hands. They worked as lumberjacks and carpenters, and they moved all over the region. And then they eventually all filtered into Minneapolis in search of more opportunities. And that's both sets of my grandparents met here and got married, built businesses during the Great Depression, saved their money. And in 1942, both sets of my grandparents were able to buy houses. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing a family film that was made to celebrate this moment in my father's family. And in fact, my dad is the little guy in the overalls right there in the front. So this was such a big deal that my grandfather actually hired a film crew to come out to the new home and record the day-long party where everyone he and my grandmother had ever known were invited to come and see their new house, and everyone dressed up and washed their cars and came to celebrate. So thanks to our work, though, I now know that this house had a covenant. So that black icon on the map marks my grandparents' house, and the red that you see is all covenants. So my mom actually grew up nearby, and it was the same story there. And so although my grandparents were new arrivals to this country, they were regarded as white. We know that homes that had covenants were actually marketed to immigrants like my grandparents. So this is an ad for the Como Park neighborhood in St. Paul from a Swedish newspaper, and it prints the text of the covenant in Swedish, assuring buyers that the developer, Thomas Frankson, who would go on to become the lieutenant governor of Minnesota, would enforce covenants to the fullest extent of the law. So the fact that some new Americans were seen as white meant that they could build their lives in a place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans who had similar levels of income and education. So I grew up visiting my grandparents and listening to the stories about growing up in this neighborhood near Lake Nokomis. My parents and uncles describe it as just a wonderful place to be a kid in the 1940s. They could be outside all the time. They had parks. And really significantly for me, they had really solid schools. So both of my parents graduated from high school. They both went to college. My mother went to graduate school. And I heard about all this, but what I didn't hear about was the fact that all of this was only for white people. So my parents said that they just never questioned why their neighbors were all Swedish and Norwegian and German, that this uniform whiteness seemed utterly natural to them. But when I put on my historian's hat, I know that the number of Black people in the city is increasing rapidly in these years. Another really significant thing about the timing of when my grandparents bought their house is that they bought their house just as the United States was about to see the largest expansion of the middle class in its history. And a lot of this prosperity rested on new homeownership, which had been deliberately supported by new federal programs in the 1930s. So these programs spurred the creation of the modern mortgage. They also, which allowed many more people to own their own homes, they also prompted redlining. So we know that for FHA loans, 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. So 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were encouraged to buy houses in a part of the city where property values climbed throughout the 20th century. So our research shows that today, more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, houses in Minneapolis that had covenants, like my grandparents' house, are worth 15% more than identical houses that never had covenants. So my grandparents passed this additional value onto me. When my grandfather died, my family sold his house and split the proceeds among the grandchildren. And I and my cousins we all took our piece and used it to make down payments on other homes. So realtors can tell you that I'm fortunate but not exceptional. They've actually been doing research on where people get money for down payment assistance. And at least 30% of first-time home buyers get this kind of assistance from family to manage the purchase of a home. So like many of my peers, I was able to leverage the economic security of my grandparents to secure the future of my children. But, my kids will tell you, because their mom is a historian, they hear all the time about how the opportunities that they have were shaped by the opportunities that my grandparents had. So as a family, we talk all the time about how none of us are unencumbered. We all carry our history with us. So we're trying to do that. My work with Mapping Prejudice, I'm trying to make that easier for everyone to see, for everyone to see how to locate themselves in this map and in this history. And what our volunteers tell us is that it's participating in this work, helping us to transcribe these deeds, that helps them to see structural racism. And that's why we continue the work. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. So, racism is not just a matter of personal bias. It's not it's not as easy sometimes to recognize as the sentiments of these protesters who picketed the Minnesota state hearings on fair housing in 1962. So we want people to understand that racism has been written into the foundational documents of our communities. And I think that this history helps us understand so much about today. It helps us understand why it's the same group of people who are so vulnerable to housing insecurity, that the system is actually working exactly how it was designed to work, which was to keep Black and brown people from owning property. So what do we do? How do we change course? So the first step has to be remembering, and I want to thank you all for being in this space and remembering collectively. I think this is the first step in the process of repair. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about reparations as being the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. But we also need to change material conditions. And that's not something that one person can do. That's not one policy outcome. There's not one easy fix for all this. It takes everyone. So in my work with Mapping Prejudice, I have decided to use the tools that I have developed as a historian to make change. So I go out to groups and talk to people about who we are as a community and what has happened in the past. And I'm here with you in this virtual space because this is how I generate the hope, frankly, to move forward. So I want to ask all of you, what tools do you have and where can you put them to work? I'm handing the baton to you. Like, how do we make meaningful change? When you look at the institutions or the organizations or the places where you have influence, what needs to happen? And I also want to know, we want to know, Penny and Rebecca and I, who are here tonight with you, how can we help? What are the resources that we can provide to you as you're working to make this change? When people wonder about where to start, I point them in a couple different places. I always point to the Equity in Place Coalition, which offers a whole policy agenda for people who are looking to back meaningful change. And I point to this coalition, which offers a very wide range of policy ideas because it's a coalition of people, of organizations that are controlled by people of color. It's always important to look to the people and organizations that center racial equity. It's important to look to the people who are most affected by a problem for solutions, right? Mapping Prejudice is also a founding member of the Just Deeds Coalition, which is active in cities and organizations across Minnesota. And we're a coalition of stakeholders that have pledged to work together to identify and dismantle structural racism in the spheres where we have influence. So here's some action points for you. What are the groups in your community that are thinking about ways to dismantle the harm that's done by these policies? What are their priorities? And we need to start asking these questions if we want to really work on not just remembering, but repairing the damage. So I'll end with a quote from James Baldwin, who said, "As long as you pretend you don't know your history, you're going to be a prisoner of it." So now that we are free, where would you like to go? Where are we going to go as a community? So with that, I think I will stop sharing, and with any luck, we'll have some questions.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was insightful and inspiring. It's hard to digest all those questions immediately, just what's the answer, right? I'll ask a question, and I did in the chat, which was just tying what kind of study, relative to colonialism and indigenous histories, right? Like racism didn't start in 1910. And what kind of parallels or does that set up for you as a historian researcher trajectories towards the future?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think you're saying before racial covenants, this didn't start all in 1910, right? It's earlier than that. And yes, I mean, racial covenants really build on the foundation that was, established by the land seizures of the Minnesota Makoche from the Native people. And after the land seizures, the U.S. Dakota War was the retribution to the U.S. Dakota War was the act that pushed all Dakota people out of the state of Minnesota. So a lot of the collective remembering, I would say, around the U.S. Dakota War, which was is sort of like the moment where Minnesota became an all-white state. The moment where settler colonialism was victorious. And I would say that all that sort of those collective ideas really laid the groundwork for racial covenants, which were meant, they weren't a response to a large number of Black people who were already in residence. They were preemptive. They were meant to keep Minnesota all white. So in that sense, it is one arc, which it's all the same arc, right? Which is the idea that of how do we keep Minnesota entirely white? So yes, so we could talk a lot about that, but that's the short answer to a very big question.
Cool. I have a question here. In interpreting the language used in the covenants, were Jews considered Caucasian or of other race? This author says something about covenants specifically called out Jews, but curious about who's called white or Caucasian.
Yeah, that is a great question again. So the answer to that is that Jews were always liminally white, right? Sometimes they were white and sometimes they weren't white. And there's not, I mean, this is one of the things that illustrates so well the social construction of race, like who that it is not, there's nothing biological about race in the sense that these are constructions that people make. So in many of the early covenants, Jews are named. And in part, in reaction to that, the Jewish community organizes and goes to the legislature in 1919, gets the Minnesota legislature to pass a law that makes it illegal to discriminate on the basis of religion in real estate transactions. And after that point, you really have explicit language that name Jews specifically dropping out of covenants after 1919. So Minnesota is somewhat unusual, but of course we all know that there's a very strong strain of anti-Semitism in Minneapolis. So that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism disappeared, right? In real estate, in real estate. But what we found, and I want to call out again, Penny Peterson has done some amazing research on this, is that we found that in some suburbs, Jews are considered white, they're considered Caucasian, and in some suburbs they're not. So St. Louis Park, which is even when you have a large Jewish community in St. Louis Park, the suburb is completely covered with covenants. We found many Jewish families living in houses that had racial covenants. We find Jewish property developers putting covenants in. Edina seems to be a different story. Like in Edina, Caucasian seems to be interpreted as not including Jews. So this is just a really, it illustrates the complexity of these of these restrictions, and that there's sometimes there's not a really simple answer to some of these questions.
Following on that, covenants in commercial properties as well. Have you found any of that?
I don't think we have. Have we, Penny? You're muted.
There are some in the Edmund Walton Seven Oaks, and basically what it is it's for there's the store below is not covenanted racially, but the apartment above is. But those were very far and few between, because they some of them run along.
Oops, you got muted, Penny.
There was a pattern of living above the store for some people, like small grocery stores, that sort of thing. But the commercial part was not covenanted, but the apartment above was.
Kirsten, oh, he's got another.
Ahead, Donna.
Oh, thank you.
There's a few more in the chat, but we still have time. So go ahead, Donna. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just jumped in at the moment when I heard that it was the Twin Cities or Minneapolis that is the epicenter kind of what we're talking about in this mapping prejudice. And I don't think that was addressed in the presentation this evening. And I would be curious to know, why is our area like this, or was like this?
So your question is what is, like, I'm sorry, what specifically?
Oh, why is it our area that is most well, I'm not even sure how to ask the question, because I'm just wondering why you pointed out that we're the most in all the country in the United States.
Yeah, we have the highest racial disparities in housing, home ownership rates and housing.
So
in the
what
country.
have you uncovered for why that is true?
So so one of the problems is that if you're going to study racial covenants, we created the first ever comprehensive map of these racial covenants. So we don't have a lot of great comparative data to know why they had such a profound effect here versus other places. But I mean, we really believe that racial covenants are key to this our contemporary situation. And we think it has a lot to do with the timing of the way racial covenants were put in so thoroughly and so overwhelmingly at a very key moment in the development of the city, which really made it hard for people who are not white to get a foothold in terms of land and property here. And it really made it I would say, really interrupted networks of mutual aid. That we know that that's a really important way that people, build community and help one another, acquire property. And these things have a very long, shelf life, or, it's not like if you make something illegal, then everything is fixed in 10 years. I mean, I always tell the story of my family to illuminate sort of the intergenerational impact of these earlier policies that just because something has been illegal since 1968, it really, unless you make a really concerted effort to repair what has come before, it continues to compound. In fact, it continues to get worse. So that's our best, I would say, most educated guess about why we think Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular have, part of the story of why the racial disparities in homeownership and housing are so pronounced here. It has to do with the timing of when these blanket racial restrictions were put into place and what that did to communities, to networks of mutual aid, and to home ownership and land ownership over time.
Awesome. So we have a number of questions that would really like to dive in and ask how mapping prejudice and the 2040 plan, and the goals of the plan for affordable housing and equity. I know there's a few other facets of this larger, broader topic that are in the chat. So if you see those, but trying to rectify patterns of racism and any of the goals that have been outlined, and how do you see that working or playing with the ideas that you've described tonight?
Yeah, I mean, so the people who developed the 2040 plan really used our data very heavily in the 2040 plan to illuminate the need for change, for dramatic change. And so I would say that's the most, that's the closest connection between our research and our data and the 2040 plan. I think the authors of the 2040 plan were taking this, they were looking at the situation that we have, this contemporary housing crisis, and they were trying to come up with bold solutions. And obviously Minneapolis made a lot of headlines around the country for eliminating single family zoning. And what do we know about zoning, the relationship between zoning and covenants? We know that the same year that covenants were made illegal in Minnesota, that was actually the year in Minneapolis that single family zoning was adopted. And so what a lot of researchers will say is that the contemporary zoning codes, or the zoning codes that were adopted after racial covenants became illegal, really locked in the patterns that were established by covenants. And so, that zoning, the zoning code, around the country really is the place that you have to look to do a lot of this reparative work. But I can also tell you that people who work in housing will say that just changing the zoning is not going to solve the housing crisis. That there's so many other things at play. It would be so lovely if you could change one thing and all this work, all this repair work would be, done, right? But we have all these other inequities in play. So unless you put all kinds of other policy, and again, I am not a policy person. I want to be very clear. We are historians. That's what we do. And we try to provide the historical context that modern policymakers need to really understand sort of the perils of bad policy in the past, and also understanding how we got here. In order to unbuild something, you have to understand how it was built, right? So that's some of the that's what we can do as a project. So I think it's very hard to come up with a lot of creative reparative solutions if you're locked into a very rigid zoning code that requires single family housing. I can say that, but eliminating single family zoning alone is not going to do the trick. It is not going to repair the damage.
Unrelated, I think kind of a bit of the trajectory here, right? You've talked a lot about structural segregation and kind of what's written and manifest in law, and you've described that at a certain point that those changes happen during really formative periods in the city's history, and so the kind of effects and outcomes of that are long lasting. And so in a way, someone writes here, is class the new race? And is it sort of now unstructured as we're kind of removing these covenants, but we still have this history that now has set people at different capacities and abilities for intergenerational wealth and other ways of wealth distribution. So are we still sort of even having these sort of market-driven, does it turn out to be sort of a market-driven covenant that maintains racial segregation because people are priced out, for example?
Well, we know that that the racial wealth gap is huge. But it is still, race is still salient. Like when economists do analyses, they try to figure out every other factor, but race always still is pertinent. So I mean, if you look at even income levels, if you can take people of different races who have exactly the same incomes and they have dramatically different access to housing and to credit and to so race, no matter what, race is still baked into all of this. Yes, what's your economics of, like what's it, housing, if it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, if you have wildly different economic situations, of course, that's another piece of it, but it is not the only factor still.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for your time. We'll try to, again, this meeting is recorded, so we'll be posting it online so that folks can watch it afterwards. I'm sure, Kristen, I don't know if I can broadcast your email and share it with everyone if there's follow-up questions. I would actually probably invite everyone to the next Zoning and Housing Committee meeting next December 12th, I think it is, at 7 p.m. We'll take at least a few moments as part of the agenda to ask some of the questions that you left us with at the end, so that we can keep a conversation going and moving forward. I guess are there any other parting thoughts or comments that that anyone has for moving the conversation to the next place?
I guess I just want to make a plug, right? Rebecca, are you unmuting to make a plug? I'm going to let Rebecca do it.
No, I was going to say a couple of things. Is if there are questions too, you can always send it to Mapping Prejudice, our email at umn.org. Is that correct? Which would then filter it to all of us so that we could triage it. Second thing is I put in the chat, if you're interested in exploring, looking at having an experience of working with covenants, you can join our volunteer transcription sessions that take place on Wednesdays, and they alternate between noon and 7 o'clock every other week. So if you can do a noon work hour or in the evening. And then lastly, I would also, if you want to follow us and learn more about what we're up to, you can go onto our website, and on the bottom right-hand corner is you can put in your own email and you can subscribe to our newsletter, which will keep you abreast of articles and events and any other information that we wanted to send out. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, good luck with your discussion. Now translated into policy.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Okay.
Now for something completely different, everyone, but not, right? I mean, there's an interconnected web here, certainly. But
Okay.
I will try to make thank you very much,
Thank you.
Kirsten and team. Thank you very
Thanks.
kindly.